Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 153. My name's Dan Lizette, and thank you all very much for taking the time to listen. Great episode here for you. I want to tell you all about it. But before we do, just real quickly, this week's show is brought to you by Podbean. It is podcast hosting and monetization. It's the easiest way to get started in this podcasting game. Go to podbean.com/TPD. More info in your first month for free if you use that custom URL. I will tell you more about Podbean in just a little while. But this week's show is a big one. I really was excited to talk to this gentleman who is my guest today. It is Nando Vila from We Came to Win. It's a brand new show over at Gimlet Media, and it is, of course, based around soccer. That will become clearly evident in our conversation, and if you start listening, which I hope you do, at least by the end of listening to this episode. But really, it's about so much more, and I truly believe that you don't have to be a soccer fan, a sports fan, or really any fan of sports or soccer to enjoy this, as long as you just enjoy great storytelling. It has given the Gimlet treatment, and they really do a great job with the stories that are shared on We Came to Win, and the team behind it, as well as Nando, do a great job in presenting those to you. So I really hope that you guys enjoy this conversation. I think that you will. Gimlet has been a good friend of mine here at the Podcast Digest. I was looking back just a moment ago, and come to find out, way back on episode 33, I had Alex Goldman from Reply All, one of my earliest guests. So Gimlet was kind even in the early days here to the Podcast Digest. That episode came out in 2015. Wow. Alex, if you by chance hear this, do you feel old at all? I feel old. But since then, on episode 122, Wendy Zuckerman from Science Versus was my guest. And on episode 133, Jonathan Goldstein from Heavyweight have all joined me here. And I hope to be talking to more Gimlet hosts in the future as well. So without further ado, folks, let's get to this week's conversation. That's a habit this week. It probably should be this month, but just a little asterisk. I'm hopeful to start increasing my frequency of releases again. That's not a promise, but it is a possibility as things have changed a little bit for me on the time and availability side. So stay tuned. It might happen. You can follow me at Pod Digest. That is the absolute best place to get all the news and notes and ongoing updates from me and the Podcast Digest over on Twitter. I would appreciate it. And news to follow, possibly. But what's to follow right now is my conversation with Nando Vila from We Came to Win. All right, folks, as I mentioned up front, my guest this week for the Podcast Digest, first-time guest. I know I've had a few recent revisits from folks, but it's Nando Vila from the brand new season show, if you will. We Came to Win in Gimlet Media. And Nando, welcome to the Podcast Digest, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining me. Lots to talk about, and I've been listening to the show. I'm up to date at the time of recording, folks. There is 6 episodes out in the queue. There may be a couple of more by the time you're hearing this, and we're going to dive deep on that. But before we do, I want folks who are not familiar with you, Nando, to learn a little bit more. So let's go way back, if we could. Sure. Way back before the podcast, before the TV, before anyone knew who in the world you were. Where'd you grow up? What'd you want to do growing up? And kind of how did this road start for you?
Well, I grew up in Miami, Florida. I was born and raised there. Both my parents were from Spain. They came to the United States in the late 70s and early 80s, respectively. And I was born and raised in Miami. I lived there my whole life. And what I wanted to do when I grew up, I don't think I really knew. I never really thought about it. I was just kind of living my life and not too worried about the future. I still do kind of live my life that way, to be honest. I don't think too far ahead ever. So maybe I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up, but yeah.
I've said the same thing.
Yeah.
But did you, let's say this, and through high school in the later years, did you feel pulled to something? I mean, was it always kind of a, entertainment vibe? Did you think it would be something along those lines, or was it something else?
Yeah, I remember my dad talks about it now. He still laughs about it, but I very early on developed a sort of hatred of the sort of office grind. I remember the movie Office Space when it came out had a huge impact on me. Like just the alienation and despair that comes with that kind of sort of corporate, middle class white collar job. That I knew that I didn't want to do anything like that. That was very obvious to me that if I lived that kind of life, I would end up in a state of deep depression. So I always knew I wanted to do something other than that, something that excited me more than that. But I didn't know what it was going to look like, and I certainly never thought of myself as a future TV host or radio host or anything like that. I just knew I didn't want to work in a sort of office job.
So after school, was there college involved? What did we do immediately after?
I went to college. I went to Boston College. I studied history and with a music minor. Same thing. I didn't do it with a sort of career in mind. I didn't really know what I wanted to do throughout college. I just knew I liked the humanities. I liked studying art and history and things like that. So I was always very interested in, culture and learning about different cultures and learning about politics and why things work the way they do and things like that. But I never thought of a career in that. And, it's one of those things, like when I graduated, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I actually just got an internship right after college at a small magazine based out of Miami that very few people read, but that kind of got me on my start in media.
And so a magazine, what was their beat? What was the topic?
It was a Hispanic business magazine called Poder.
Oh.
So,
okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the history background, obviously converts to business writing very well.
Yes,
I'm sure.
Obviously. Well, maybe more than people would like to think. I mean, I guess a lot of business writers would do well to know more history, I guess.
That's true. Yeah. I'm sure.
I think everyone would do well to know more history, to be honest.
So you were writing? You were a reporter?
No, I was actually working for. I mean, I did write a little bit for them. I wrote a few pieces for them, but that wasn't my main thing. I wrote a series of pieces for them about conflict resolution and reconciliation processes throughout the world. So like South Africa and Chile and Spain, things like that. But mainly what I did was I produced events for them. I was an event producer. They would do these like sort of conferences where they would invite speakers to come, interesting people and influential people, and then they would speak about various issues, and people would come. It was kind of like a mini, maybe like a mini TED or something like that, but very small scale compared to TED. But yeah, I was working on that side for them, and that's what I was doing right after college.
And just to kind of stick a pin and connect it to now, I'm assuming during this whole time, you're a huge soccer/football fan.
Oh, yeah, my whole life. I was a huge soccer fan. My father really beat it into me when I was a young kid. There's a story of, my mom tells a story of when he was sort of pushing me in the hospital on the little cart, and I was a little baby and they were trying to get me to go to sleep. He would just recite the lineup of Real Madrid in the Champions League final, in the European Cup final of 1966. He knew it by heart, and he would just recite it over and over and over again as a way to kind of lull me to sleep. So I guess it was beat into me since I was a baby. And then I played soccer throughout my life. That was my main sport. I wasn't very good at any other sports. I was decent at soccer, not great. And yeah, just was a fan right from the beginning.
So let me ask you, you're of, do you mind if I ask you how old you are?
I'm 32.
Okay, 32. So back then when you were a kid growing up, was MLS even here yet?
No, MLS came in 1996, so
yeah.
I was born in 85, yeah.
I'm thinking to myself, I've always wondered this, was it hard in America to be a soccer fan growing up, in the sense that you can't turn it on a Saturday afternoon typically and find baseball, basketball, or football, those type of things? I mean, was it just the love from playing that kind of pushed you to find all this information?
Oh, it was very hard. I mean, it was very hard. I remember when I was a kid, you know, they barely had any soccer on TV, almost never. But my parents knew a couple people. They had a couple friends who had installed these like giant satellite dishes in their backyard and would basically steal a signal from Latin America, from South America. That we would watch like ESPN Brazil or like a feed from Argentina or something like that. And I'm not quite sure how they did it back then, but they went through to great lengths to be able to watch the Spanish League or the Champions League and things like that. And I remember like just going to this person's house every weekend to watch soccer. And I was lucky enough, because my parents were from Spain and their entire family was still in Spain, I would go back to Spain a lot. I would spend basically my entire summer there every year, and I would spend Christmas break there and spring break often. And so when I was there, I would get it was like the NFL now, you know, in the United States, where it's just like on all the time, everywhere on every channel. Like that's how soccer is in Spain. It's you know, there's entire newspapers dedicated. And I would love to buy the sort of soccer newspaper, especially Marca. Like I would buy that, and it would be like a treasured thing that I had when I was a kid. But yeah, it was definitely hard, and it was you know, because a lot of kids played, so there was that, but they didn't have the sort of fan culture, if that makes sense. So like they were just players. They didn't really have a team that they supported. They could barely watch soccer on TV. They just liked to play it, but it was interesting growing up that way.
Yeah, I grew up as a rabid baseball fan, and I'm just trying to equate our childhoods. Probably very similar, right? You wake up, you think about it, you want to play it every chance you get. Anytime you can find it on TV. You talk about magazines. I collected baseball cards, and so I know that kind of mindset as a child growing up. But at least with baseball, I could literally walk out my front door and probably pluck off 3 other kids my age, and we could go play hot box or home run derby or something like that. In terms of even doing things like that from a soccer football perspective, was that even tough for you to kind of find other kids in the neighborhood to pick it up, or were they all at the basketball court or baseball field?
Yeah, I mean, well, like I said, I mean, a lot of kids played soccer, so that wasn't an issue. I mean, it's weird because in America has had this like strange relationship with soccer in which people started playing it before they started watching it. You know, it became like a very popular. I mean, there was like the soccer mom thing in the 90s, if you remember that. Like it was like a political constituency. It was the soccer moms, right? But back then there was no soccer on TV, so it was just a bunch of kids playing soccer. So yeah, I mean, I guess it was hard to talk about soccer like in school and stuff. Like I was like, you know, like I was like kind of like always trying to talk about it, and people would look at me weird because they didn't know what the hell I was talking about. Even with kids on my soccer team, you know, it just wasn't as readily available as now. But it wasn't difficult to play it. I mean, you go to the park and people were playing all the time, and you know, I was on teams since I was a kid. So I always had like my teammates and stuff. But yeah, it was definitely harder to be a fan than it was to be a player.
I've always imagined a wildly addictive quality to playing it, only because I knew growing up a handful, half a dozen, let's say, guys and girls that played, and you couldn't tell them about anything else, like any other sport, they played on the school team, and it seemed to me at least like they lived it and breathed it and didn't want to hear anything about any other sport or why they should watch or play this. They were addicted, loved it through and through.
Yeah, and I've often thought about why that is, like why soccer is kind of the universal world sport, right? And I think it has to come down to the fact that, and the addictive nature that you're referring to, it comes down to the fact that soccer is a sport that requires a huge amount of individual sort of creativity, like constantly. You know, in baseball or football, which are great sports, and I love them too. You know, there's not as much. You don't have as much room for decision making if you're an individual player. You know, it's kind of it's much more mechanical, if that makes sense. Like there's certainly a lot of skill involved, but in terms of like, you know, trying to make something happen, trying to be creative, like that's what soccer is. And I think that speaks to the appeal of something like soccer video games, like the FIFA franchise has been the most popular video game franchise for a long, long time. And it was even popular in America before soccer was as popular in America as it is today. The video games were a huge reason why a lot of kids sort of became soccer fans, and it's because the games were addicting because each game was different. Like in Madden, when you played the NFL game, like there was always a way to kind of figure it out, and there was like certain plays that you would do that you knew would work. They talk about this all the time, but when you're playing in the soccer video game in FIFA, every game you play is quite unique. You never know what's going to happen. So I think that speaks to why soccer is so addictive.
And all of that we just discussed sort of lays the groundwork for the show. But let's pick your story back up, and let's put you there as the host first. I know that one of the big things that you're also doing right now simultaneously is your work with Fusion in your TV show. But long before you were on the camera, I know you were doing a lot of producing with the network. So take us from the post-college magazine up to joining Fusion. What were you doing during that time?
So what happened was that the guy that hired me at the magazine, after a few years of being there, he got hired to run the Univision news department. And when he did that, when he moved over to the Univision news department, he brought me along with him. I had been working with him in the magazine and on a foundation that he started. And so like I immediately went from that to working in a big network, and I was working sort of on his strategy team, just kind of like as if I was like one of his aides, that if he needed to, figure out some sort of strategic thing, I would do like a bunch of research and then prepare memos for him and things like that. And so I was working there at Univision, and almost immediately, one of his big initiatives was to launch the Fusion channel. He sort of led the charge within Univision to strike a deal with ABC News to do a joint venture to launch this new cable channel, Fusion. And I was kind of immediately put on that team to sort of work on that deal on the Univision side as one of the sort of one of the grunts. So I did that for that process took about 2 years to sort of negotiate the deal, and then once the deal was agreed upon to sort of build the channel. And I was just always around in those events, right? I was involved in coming up with the case and the business plan and things like that. It was actually about a week before the Fusion channel actually launched that I learned that I was going to be a host on it, and it was because of a series of kind of random events. But for a huge amount of like kind of boring internal reasons, they really wanted to launch a soccer show, or more vaguely, they wanted to launch a sports show. Because they, at the same time that Fusion was launching, Univision had just launched a 24-hour sports network. And they were interested in doing a joint co-production between the two new networks. So they're like, oh, we'll do a sports show in English for Fusion. And I was like, okay. And they put me to develop it. And when I was developing it, I thought a better idea would be to do a soccer show, mostly because there just weren't a lot of soccer shows on at the time. This is before the Men in Blazers or anything like that was ever a thing on cable TV. So I thought it'd be fun to do a soccer show, and it would at least allow us to stand out a little bit, because if we did a show that covered the NFL, then we're competing with, the 24 hours of ESPN's 8 channels and, and all the other sports networks that cover the NFL.
Yeah, NFL Network.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. So with soccer, I felt that we had like an opportunity to stand out in a sort of limited playing field. And we developed the show, me and a producer from the Univision Sports Network. And, we had a bunch of ideas for talent and for hosts and things like that. And we got pretty far along with one guy to host the show. And then about a week before the network launched, the deal just completely fell through. He said he couldn't do it. And so we were like, oh, well, we don't have a host. We have to delay the launch of the show, which wasn't a big deal because it was kind of a small weekly show as part of like a much larger slate, and the network was brand new, and the audience was going to be small anyway, so the stakes were quite low. But the sort of executives were just like, why don't you two host it? Me and the Univision producer, who was a British guy named Simon Carr. And we're like, but we've never done that before. And they're like, it's fine. No, you'll figure it out. And so we went from being...
And you guys are cheap. So.
Yeah, exactly. We don't cost anything extra, so they're already paying us. So that's how it happened. All of a sudden, I went from 1 week to just developing the show, and then the next week we started hosting it, and it was called The Soccer Gods, and it was kind of like a silly look at the world of soccer every week. So we would do like highlights from the weekend's action, but then we would just do like a whole bunch of silly things. Like, I mean, we did not take ourselves very seriously or soccer very seriously. We thought it was a better idea to sort of treat it as fans who are just having fun rather than serious, sober analysts breaking down the X's and O's.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, Nando, but I would think that making that leap is a bigger deal than the executives were making it seem, or maybe you even had time to sort of put your arms around. I mean, when I've heard other interviews and conversations, a lot of late night shows and so on and so forth, the idea of being on camera is a big deal, right? And it's a big difference from behind the scenes. Did you even have time to process that, or did you kind of have that as a background personal aspiration, or how'd you make the transition?
No, I didn't have enough time to process it. It was very much like, overnight. And you just kind of got thrown in the ring. I remember thinking that I was just terrible at it. And I probably was. I think I was. Like, I was just, really, really bad at it at first. Not that I'm great at it now, but I'm definitely better than I was when I first started. And I remember thinking that my co-host, Simon, was actually like, very good at it. I kept on thinking, I was like, dude, you're a natural at this. Like, have you been practicing in front of the mirror your whole life? Like, you just walked right in here and you're already very good. But what helped was that the stakes were so low. It was a new network, and the audience was very small, and and even within that network, our show was kind of like a smaller show within it. So even within the small stakes of Fusion overall, it was kind of the stakes were tiny. So that helped. I mean, after the first episode was, I remember, very rough, and it took us a lot to get it out. To get it in a place where it was airable. But we figured out the kinks a little bit, and I remember just starting to feel a lot more comfortable in that role. But yeah, it definitely helped that I wasn't getting like immediate like Twitter feedback, like, oh my God, this guy sucks, like that little grace period definitely helped a lot. But yeah.
And then what happened next?
So then I did that show for a while, and it I think it was kind of like, much to the network's surprise, it kind of developed a small but very loyal cult following, I would say. It was, we were kind of there wasn't any other show quite like it on TV. So if you were kind of like a passionate soccer fan, it felt like something that you could be a part of. And we were like very generous with the audience. We would do a lot of audience participation, and then we were very sort of open ourselves. Like, we did all kinds of like really silly things, like, we would write original songs and do these music videos. We would do like entire Game of Thrones themed episodes where we would dress up as, like, I dressed up as Khaleesi for an entire episode and just hosted it, with a blonde wig and a dress, things like that. And I think, fans appreciated that we were just having the time of our lives. We were having so much fun making the show, and I think that it made the show feel very fun for them. And so there was this kind of like small but very loyal following, which was different than all the other Fusion shows at the time. We had kind of a more, I would say, like a more consistent and committed following than some of the other shows, some of which had higher ratings and things like that, but not as much of a sort of active community. So when the 2014 World Cup rolled around, Fusion sent us to Brazil, which the World Cup was in Brazil then, to do a nightly live show nightly live show from the beach of Rio de Janeiro, to talk about the World Cup every day. And we were like, whoa.
God, this sounds terrible, Nando. This sounds like a horrible assignment.
Yeah, it was horrible. Which was obviously like, we were like, what? So we ended up spending a month in Rio de Janeiro hosting a nightly show. And it was me, my co-host Simon, and 2 producers that came with us. The 4 of us made the show every night, an hour-long show for 30 nights in a row. And I got to tell you, it was a very difficult experience. I mean, it was a lot of work and it was very stressful. We had never really done a live show before. Our shows were all previously pre-taped. And it was technically very challenging to sort of route the studio into the truck to send it back to that kind of technical stuff was always very difficult. But we pulled it off, and it was a lot of fun, and it was very exciting. I think we really grew as a show and as hosts and as producers and everything, because it was kind of like a trial by fire, and I think it went really well. I mean, we got more audience than we ever had before. Our fans really liked it, and yeah, it was just an unbelievable experience, really, to be there, to be right on the beach. I remember my favorite thing we did is like the intro to every show is we did this thing where we taped back in Miami in our studio. We taped as if it was the end of one of our shows. Like we would always end on, and the soccer gods are forever. And then we would just see like cut, and we'd like pull out of our earpiece, and we'd stand up and we walk out. We were like, oh, good show. And then we walk out of the studio. We walk across Miami. We walk straight into the beach, straight into the ocean in our suits. And then and then like an Indiana Jones map comes up, and you just see a red line going from Miami to Brazil to Rio. And then once we got to Rio, we shot ourselves coming out of the water in the same clothes, and then walking straight across the beach right into our set and going, okay, we're ready to go. Like we would do things like that.
This is what we did at the end of last month.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's great.
That was a huge success for us and a very transformative experience for me. And then when Fusion was so happy with it that, they had this idea that maybe they should do a lot more of these kind of live shows around big tentpole events like the World Cup, right? So the next big tentpole event was the 2014 midterm election, and they asked me to host a live show. A nightly live show about the midterm elections.
Okay, so let's put a pin right there. Hold on. Everything so far we've talked about is in and around soccer.
Yeah.
How does it come to be like, you know what? Let's pluck this guy from the awesome soccer show and say elections.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, I studied history and politics, so like I knew I had some sort of basis for that, and then in kind of my work at the magazine, and then even in the sort of Univision news department early on, I was always more involved in just kind of general news than it was soccer. It was almost more strange for me to start hosting a soccer show. I mean, I was just a fan, right? I wasn't like I wasn't a known player. I wasn't, I didn't have any sort of soccer media chops before then. I actually probably was more well prepared to host the politics show than I was the soccer show.
But so there's no real concern to the viewers.
Oh, the viewers probably didn't know what the hell I was talking about. Yeah, the viewers were like, what the hell's going on? Why is this guy?
But in terms of preparedness, you were pretty comfortable.
Yeah, I was all right, yeah. So they asked me to host that show with an actor named Cal Penn, who you may know as Kumar from Harold and Kumar. Yeah, so we did that show for about 2 months, the 2 months leading up to the midterm elections, including a live 2-hour special on the night of the midterm elections, which was also a very interesting and fun experience and something that I'd never done before. Just such a long live broadcast is an interesting thing to pull off, especially with like information coming in and like the map and all that stuff. Yeah. So that's what I did. That's what I did after that, after the Brazil show.
And before we continue with our conversation with Nando, let me just tell you folks about this episode's sponsor. It's my longtime friends over at Podbean. I wanted to give you guys just a little bit more information. If you are thinking about starting a podcast, you need to have Podbean on your radar. And let me tell you why. It's because of the features. It's what they offer, right? They can set you up with a website, just like a blog. You can customize the mess out of it. It's going to look awesome. You can share your published podcast automatically on the social networks with a high-quality embeddable player right there on Twitter and Facebook and WordPress, etc. If you've got a website already, it can integrate with that. All right, all the support you need inside of Apple Podcasts with your RSS and your iTunes. We can even import it and redirect it if you are coming from another hosting provider. Maybe you're already a podcast host and you're like, I could use a new home for this. Put Podbean on that list, all right? You're going to get comprehensive podcast stats. You can be part of their online directory where they've got tons of promotional opportunities. They've even got integrated monetization tools. You can designate episodes as premium. There's a full-blown advertising platform. Guys, I've been in the system. I've seen it. There's a lot going on there, as well as a patron program where you can ask your listeners to support you directly. You can even share your podcast to YouTube and Tumblr. And I mentioned WordPress, several WordPress integrations. There's a WordPress plugin, and there's tons of tools that Podbean provides for you guys. That is just means they need to be on your list, right? A lot of people listening right now may think, I want to start my own podcast, or I'm thinking about starting a podcast, or I don't know if I'd be good enough to start a podcast. You are. All right, trust me. I was in your seat not too long ago, and Podbean is somebody you need to check out. So go to podbean.com/TPD. That stands for the Podcast Digest. That will give you your first month for free, and it will let them know that you came from listening to the show, and it helps out a lot. So do it, and I think you'll love it. Now, back to my conversation with Nando. And I know you also did a little bit more on the 2016 election, something similar as well, the presidential election. And I know you've got the current show, which has a, is basically a political sketch comedy that's, pretty much sourced there with Happy Ending, with your name in the show title, Happy Ending with Nando Vila. I'll come back to that in a second, because I'm going to assume, just for a minute, that at some point between those two election shows and the launch of Happy Ending, conversations with or around or about We Came to Win and Gimlet started to happen, yes?
No, actually, the conversations with We Came to Win came way later. They came after.
Oh.
Yeah, the conversation with Gimlet didn't come until after I'd already started producing the Happy Ending show.
Oh, wow. I had that timeline completely wrong. So,
yeah.
All right. Well,
those conversations didn't start until about, I think it was October, November of last year. So yeah, they were very recent and very quick.
Okay, well, let's get to We Came to Win, because that's really what I want to talk about. But I do want to spend some time. We'll wrap up with Happy Ending. Hey, that seems appropriate, doesn't it? So talk to me about those conversations, about how that happened. Was it something that you reached out first, or they came to you, or how did that all work?
They came to me. I think the showrunner of We Came to Win, what we call here the senior producer, is a guy named Matt Nelson, who was the senior producer for a very successful show for them, and a very good show called Mogul, which sort of looks at hip-hop history through the lens of this one executive named Chris Lighty. And if anyone out there hasn't listened to it, I highly, highly recommend it. It's just I
will second that. Yeah. I've listened to it. It was amazing.
Yeah. So he, coming off of that show, he's a big soccer fan. He's from Scotland, and he sort of pitched this show to the We Came to Win show to Gimlet, and I guess they were when he reached out to me, they were almost about to greenlight it. They basically told him they were going to greenlight it, and so he reached out to me because he remembered me from my Soccer Gods day, from my days from when I was doing the soccer show. I guess we had run into each other at an event. I to be honest, I didn't remember, but we had met at some sort of soccer media event in Miami, and he just remembered me, and he was like, well, I know that guy. So he reached out to me, and I immediately jumped at the opportunity. I was like, yeah, I'll do whatever I can to make this show.
Were you a fan of the medium already?
Yeah, big time. Yeah, I love podcasts. I was a huge podcast fan before they reached out.
There was no intimidation of the idea of moving from some of your television work over to podcasting. Were you starting to think about some of the things you may have to do differently, or what was your thought behind approaching the medium?
Well, there definitely were, and I definitely thought about the things I would have to do differently, and then I definitely learned very quickly that some of the things that I relied a lot on TV just did not work in in podcasting. But I had actually been wanting to launch my own podcast for a long time, and had a few conversations with Fusion about launching my own before the Gimlet show. So I'd been thinking about it for a long time, but I learned a lot of things that I didn't know right when I started at working on this show. Mostly having to do with my delivery. Just that on TV, you just have to be so much bigger than you think. Like I remember when I look back at my early shows on the Soccer Gods, I'm like, man, am I about to fall asleep? And like I remember like when I was in the chair, I was like, oh my god, I'm like talking so fast and I'm moving around a lot, and like no, it's like your energy on TV has to be so much higher. Only like the real great TV broadcasters can pull off the sort of low energy thing and still make it engaging. That's how you know like that a guy's very good. But most of us mortal TV broadcasters have to be much bigger. And in podcasting, you don't. You have to be the opposite. You have to be very intimate, and you have to slow down because they can't read your lips. You don't have any visuals to support what you're saying. So on TV, you realize that you get away with a lot of things because people can see things, right?
Right.
They can see graphics or words, and just even looking at your face and seeing your lips move, it helps the audience understand what you're saying. But in podcasting, you have none of that. You really have to make sure that every word you say is, the audience can hear it.
And I imagine a lot of that advice and guidance came from what I assume to be an absolutely phenomenal team over at Gimlet.
Oh, the best. I'm floored by the editorial rigor within Gimlet. It's something that I've just never worked with. I've never worked with anything like it. Matt, the showrunner, is an unbelievably skilled producer and can make anything sound good. I mean, it's truly amazing what he can do. But beyond that, just the company as a whole has an editorial process that is unlike anything I've ever witnessed, and it's of a degree of sophistication and rigor that is truly astounding. Every single word that is uttered on a Gimlet show has been masticated over and over and over again. Every single bit of sound you hear, every little music cue, everything is studied and decided on in a very deliberate fashion and in a very cooperative fashion, which I think is also like another amazing thing about Gimlet, is that they have this system of kind of allowing people from other teams to listen in as the episode is being baked and to give their opinion and things like that, which is like a thing that in my world, in the TV world, everyone is very protective of their turf. They would not let anyone from another show listen to or watch, your episode, a rough draft or anything to get their thoughts. I mean, that's just unheard of. Everyone's kind of very protective of the turf. You don't want, and the notes process is a much more acrimonious one. Here it really has been, that has been an amazing experience of working with Gimlet. I got to say, it's something that I'll never, ever forget.
I look back at my back catalog, and I believe that I have at least interviewed 2 or 3 hosts, and 2 or 3 hosts of shows or other roles that they have now left those and are at Gimlet. I know Devin Taylor's over there with you guys. Yeah. I believe Megan Tan's now doing some work with you guys. Yeah. And then, of course, I've talked with the guys from Reply All. And just in my experience in talking and getting to know them, I mean, Megan I talked to twice, and I know that it's just to think about that team, and that is, I know, 5 out of 100 plus, I believe. Yeah. Gimlet's well over 100 plus at this point. That the talent that Alex and Matt and company have aggregated there just must be a phenomenal group. To be honest, I bet you're quote unquote learning a lot.
I'm learning a ton, and Devin Taylor is actually one of the editors on the We Came to Win show. Yep. And she's amazing. I mean, her ability to sort of structure a story is just like it's unbelievable. I
think she was episode 50 for me, and you are 153. Wow. And I talked to her way back when she was writing the timbre.
Oh, wow.
Her website. That was 2 or 3 years ago, I think we spoke. Wow. Maybe 3 years ago, yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
I reached out to her because I loved her website. Right. This was before I believe she was officially associated with any show. I could be wrong.
Well, you
about
have you have a good eye for talent then.
I've caught a few of those folks way early on and then watched them kind of go on to something else. But yeah, and so talk a little bit about, on average, I know these things are not produced week to week. You said it was November-ish timeline of last year that things got started. So take us from then to episode 1 release. What was the process like?
So it was a little tricky because I was still producing the Happy Ending show, and I wrapped on that show. I knew I was going to wrap on that show in early March, the first week of March. And I live in LA. That's where I'm based out of, and Gimlet's in New York. So it was a little difficult in the early, even though I was kind of involved on the periphery of the sort of development of We Came to Win. I was involved in some early meetings, and I would give my thoughts and notes and stuff on some of the pitches and things like that. But I didn't really get involved until the first week of March, when after I wrapped the Happy Ending show, I flew to New York and installed myself here temporarily to work full time on the Gimlet show. So we had about, I guess the show debuted on April 25th, and I arrived on March 10th. So I mean, I dropped right in, started at 1,000,000 miles an hour right from day one. It was like falling into the middle of the process, and I sort of started right away.
So were the team more involved in sort of the topic selection, and you were able to come in to fill in some of the details, or how about the subject matter of some of these episodes?
There was the team sort of basically had, by the time I sort of arrived full time, the episodes were basically already decided upon, the topics of which I weighed in on, and I gave my thoughts, and I suggested some, and there was like a whole pitch process of which I was participated from afar, but not sort of very intimately. And by the time I arrived, most of the topics had already been chosen. Certainly the sort of first few that we were going to do were already very much underway.
And be honest, Nando, as a soccer super fan at this point, when you're seeing these topics develop and you get there in March, are you like hopping out of your chair to be like, this is going to be awesome?
Yeah, no, I had a ton of confidence in Gimlet's ability to make this show great. All their other shows are very good. I mean, I haven't listened to a bad one yet. They vary from very, very good to great. So I knew that I was very excited on that front, because when I arrived and I met the team and I saw just how sophisticated their editorial process was. I mean, that became obvious right away. I was very excited to be a part of it. I felt honored, to be honest, to be a part of it, and I felt like I was going to learn a ton. Like, I felt like this was going to be a hugely formative thing in my career, and I had that feeling like almost from day one. So yeah, I mean, I was very excited because I knew that a lot of these stories were great, and I knew that. The thing about soccer is, like, as I was alluding to earlier, American fan culture is very young. It's very young in the sense that when most soccer fans were growing up, there was no coverage of it on TV. There was no soccer on SportsCenter. There was no soccer show that sort of broke everything down, and there was so a lot of the lore of soccer, especially of the things from the past, just weren't talked about in the United States for a very long time. So a lot of people that became soccer fans in the United States sort of never had that sort of oral tradition passed on to them. Whereas if you become a soccer fan in Spain or France or Brazil or whatever, you grew up hearing stories of the past and of the great ones and of the best players and of crazy things that have happened in World Cups and in the European Cup and whatever. Those stories just have never really been told for an American audience ever. So I grew up like listening to them because of my family and things like that. So I knew that these stories were great and that they deserved sort of an audience and someone to tell them well. And I knew that Gimlet would do a great job because they do a great job on everything. So yeah.
Well, and not, I'm sure I'm not the first one to ever tell you this, but, to just add an additional checkbox for you, I think I'm probably, in the plum target audience here. I'm sports knowledgeable, a sports fan, but I was never into soccer whatsoever. Yeah. However, I am intrigued by each episode of We Came to Win because I don't think that you have to be a soccer fan. I think that's definitely the case. I think maybe some sports familiarity, just the idea of, competition and the work to win and the desire to win helps receive these stories better. But I don't even know if that's necessary in the end. And I'll tell you what, I have never listened to a soccer podcast. I at all. I do watch World Cup when it comes on, but I'm one of those, right? Like, the casual just watch the Super Bowl type football fan. Yeah. I'm that. World Cup comes on, I'm watching it. But other than that, I don't. But what you guys are doing with We Came to Win has been intriguing for me episode to episode.
Yeah, I mean, you said it right. I mean, you're the perfect audience for this show. A sort of casual sports fan, or maybe a hardcore sports fan of other sports, but who likes the idea of sports generally, and would want to get into these stories. I mean, I think that's perfect. That's the perfect audience for us. I mean, you definitely do not have to be a hardcore soccer fan. Although if you are a hardcore soccer fan, I think you still like the show because, like I said, even the most diehard fans in the United States just haven't, through no fault of their own, just haven't really had the opportunity to consume a lot of media here about it. Like, it's only like if you're very proactive and like sought out, like, I don't know, documentaries from the UK or things like that, but it's not been served up to you the way, NFL, the way stories about, the 72 Dolphins were served up to me growing up in Miami my whole life, right? Like,
that's all they talk about down there.
Exactly.
And LeBron leaving.
Yeah,
now, so.
Exactly. So, I think even for non-sports fan, if you gave it a chance, I think the podcast will suck you in, and you can get into it. I mean, I think it was an interesting process, right? Because on our team, on We Came to Win, the only quote unquote soccer fans are me and Matt, the showrunner, but there's a whole lot of other people on the team. There's producers, there's editors, there's sound people, all the things. And it's been a very interesting and I think very healthy editorial process, the sort of give and take. Like sometimes like I'll say something that that a non-soccer fan like just won't understand. It's like, I'm sorry, like that's something that's confusing to me. Like I won't understand it. And so we have to sort of adjust to make it understandable for just a casual sports fan that doesn't know like a lot of the lingo and a lot of and how things are described. But we also have to describe things in a way that doesn't sort of turn off soccer fans. So that's been a very fine line to walk, but it's been a very fun one. And I think we might make a mistake here or there and sort of overstep on one side or the other, but that's been a very conscious thing that we've done throughout the process here. Sort of try to make it so that it's appealing to the regular person rather than the hardcore soccer fan.
Yeah, and I think that's been done. I mean, I'll give you an example where I think you guys check that box for sure. I believe it's episode 5. Hopefully, I'm not going to get the wrong episode here, but I believe it was 5 when there was talk of, or maybe it was 3, because I know this was way back when some of the old stadiums and how they were built, and that the crowds were just being crushed in these segmented areas of the stadiums, and what it was like to see that happen, and so on and so forth. And I don't care who you are. If you're just a person hearing that story, you can kind of visualize this and, feel for what it must have been like to have been there. And, that has nothing to do with sports. Right.
I mean, that story is a, obviously very tragic one. It's the Hillsborough tragedy of 1989 in England, when 96 fans were killed watching a soccer game because they got crushed to death. I mean, it's the kind of thing. I mean, can you imagine if that happened here? If there was a stadium calamity like that in which 96 people were crushed to death by a crowd?
That would be crazy.
I mean, it's a lot of people. And obviously, this story has been a huge deal in the UK for decades. There's been inquiries, and it's still a live issue in many ways in the UK. But it's not it's not super well known here. But it's the kind of thing that anyone can relate to in a way. Like I've gotten tons of messages from people that have listened to that show and had no idea about that story. And it's like, man, that is my worst nightmare because it's a really horrifying story.
And so far, through the first 6 episodes, those type of stories kind of are peppered in, and I think there is an approachability. Yeah. I think I agree with you. It's an approachable topic for anyone, sports fan or otherwise. If you're a sports fan of any sport, you should be jumping on this, folks. You should be subscribing and taking a listen, and I have a feeling that it's going to appeal to you regardless. I want to kind of spin off to one thing you mentioned. You talked about the different groups and people who are all chipping in to make this. You mentioned sound, and I got to just say this. We came to win my vote 2018 best ad music of any Gimlet show. I'm sorry. The startup ad music, Alex, if you're listening, let's change up the startup ad music. I'm ready. The We Came to Win ad music is the best ad music in Gimlet. So, for what it's worth.
Well, I appreciate that. The ads are very important. They keep us alive here.
Yeah, and I love it. The dual whistle blow at the start of the ad. It's almost hyping.
Yeah.
It's just want to mention that. But sound as a whole is kind of a big deal in this because you guys bring in so much broadcast from actual matches, as well as interview, kind of archival interviews, if you will, in some of the episode, and a lot of the audio choices that are being made has been pretty awesome to hear.
Yeah, I mean that's something that I'm just blown away by. I mean, it's something that I have very little input on because I have no idea what I'm doing.
Right.
So, the credit to that goes to Matt, our senior producer, who is very careful about sound design and very into sound design. I mean, and then Bobby Lord, our sound engineer, who writes and performs a lot of the original music on the show, like the theme song, and like whenever you hear like a little like in episode 4, which is a Maradona episode about Diego Maradona, all that guitar is written and produced and performed originally here internally at Gimlet, which is like amazing to me.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And each episode has the theme melody is the same, but the style in which it's performed is different each time to sort of fit the mood or the culture of the episode. So, the Zaire episode will have, Zaire. We had Congolese musicians come in and perform the theme in that style, and the England episode has sort of like a late '80s, early '90s Brit synth pop sensibility, but it's always the same thing, and it's just so cool that they think about those little details, and who knows if like a part of the audience even realizes it, but I think subconsciously, I think everyone realizes that the episodes just sound very lush and very rich. That's the feeling that I always have when I listen to them. I'm like, man, they make me sound so much better than I am. It's like everything sounds so rich and so good.
Well, you were talking earlier, Nando, about the difference between kind of how you have to approach TV and what you've learned on hosting the podcast. And I was going to say this then, but when you talk about sort of the sound production and the lushness of it, you personally almost do sound different. I watched some of your clips of some of the interviews you've done, some of the conversations you've had, and it does kind of sound, you do sound distinctly different on the podcast, not in a bad way, but definitely there's kind of a different flavor there.
Yeah, I mean, for one, I'm just speaking way more slowly. That was like the constant note I got when I was tracking the early episodes. Was like, dude, slow down. Yeah, and I was like, oh, okay. It took a second to adjust to that, but yeah, I mean, I probably sound way different. It was just a different experience here. I mean, on my Fusion show, I mean, the thing is, I started doing a lot of digital videos for Fusion as well, and the thing with digital videos is that you got to be quick, man. The online, it's fast. I mean, you have to like basically grab someone in the first 0.75 seconds,
right.
And so you got to like come out with the information and just grab, and it's got to be like all action and quick and fast. And the thing about digital videos is that these days they're all subtitled. I mean, that's like the whole thing about the Facebook feed, and it's a whole thing, but they're all subtitled. So you can even go way faster than anyone could conceivably listen to, because they can read it along. So yeah, I mean, that was kind of like where I cut my teeth, was on these like viral digital videos that, you have to go like 1,000,000 miles an hour. And in podcasting, which is such an intimate form, like you're inside the person's ear, literally, you got to slow down. You got to slow down. If not, you'll overwhelm them.
I've heard that a lot. On the side, I do audiobook narration, and I too have heard from feedback from authors. Love it. Just the only thing, slow down a little bit, and it's the hardest thing. Yeah. It feels weird.
Yeah, totally.
It really does. We've dabbled about it a couple different times. I want to wrap up our chat today, Nando, with talking about Happy Ending with Nando Vila on the Fusion Network. Talk a little bit about we talked about how you did some work with both the 14 and 16 elections, and now this is a political sketch series on Fusion, Thursdays at 11. Tell folks about how this got started and what the experience has been like.
So Fusion asked me to develop a political show for them. I did a few shows for them already, and I did a couple documentaries for them. I did a documentary called Trumpland about the sort of the rise of Trump. This was done before the election, so it was done in the summer of 2016, and so I did a few things for them, and
you're like, that guy's never going to be elected.
Well, that was actually the thesis of that doc was when I realized that he was going to win. When I realized that he was going to win at least 30% of the vote in the primary, I was like, okay, we can stop maybe joking about this, because if 30% of Republican voters are voting for a guy like Donald Trump, that's become a collective problem. It's not become a them problem, if that makes sense. So I was like, So that was kind of my thing, is like I was like going to take it like very seriously from an early stage. But then they asked me to develop a show for them the following year, and I started thinking about that a lot. And sort of the initial phase is I was going to do like, kind of like what everyone else does, like something that's not too dissimilar from what Samantha Bee does, or not too dissimilar from what Trevor Noah does, or not too like they're all kind of the same thing. Basically, there's not too much of a format change. And then I was just like, you know what? I'm never going to like be able to compete with that level of budget and staff and writing and things like that. So I just wanted to take a radically different approach. And I was very inspired by a movie called The Big Short. I don't know if you saw it.
Yep. Absolutely.
I remember when I walked out of The Big Short, I remember thinking, if a person who knew nothing about the financial crisis, like literally nothing about the financial crisis, sat down for 2 hours and watched The Big Short, they would come out of that experience having a pretty good grasp of the financial crisis, certainly a better grasp than if they sat down and read 15 New York Times articles about it, or watched 8 hours of CNN about the financial crisis. Like the sort of the way that they were able to meld entertainment with very sharp sort of explanatory journalism, I thought was very, very brilliant, and I thought it was kind of like a new thing. It felt like a new thing to me. If you remember in that movie, they sometimes break from the action and address the camera directly to explain, credit default swaps or something incredibly complicated. So I had that idea, and I remember thinking like, the news is coming at us at 1,000,000 miles an hour from every single direction in this day and age. And it's very confusing to people because stuff just kind of happens, and it happens very quickly. And it's very hard for even very professional journalists to sort of process it all, like let alone a person who's just trying to live their life and has a day job and has a family and has a dog or whatever, so I had this idea of sort of doing a show that melded entertainment and explanatory journalism to explain sort of the basic issues facing America today at a very basic level, not dissimilar to like a Schoolhouse Rock, even like to sort of let's understand the basic fundamentals of the issue, and then that will help you process the headlines in a much more coherent way as they flood into your brain from every direction, right? So the pilot that we did was about healthcare, because healthcare is a major issue, and it's been a debate for as long as I've been active politically. I remember when Obama got elected, that was the big debate in the early years, and it was very confusing because the American healthcare system is incredibly confusing. It doesn't make any sense. No one really understands it, and it's a very powerful issue even today. I mean, it's frequently cited near the top of polling as in terms of people's sort of biggest issues. So I had this idea of just explaining the U.S. healthcare system using sketch and parody, from sort of like at the most basic level. And once you understand that, then you can understand the headlines that are coming in in a much more efficient way, if that makes sense. So we did parodies, we did sketch, we did, like movie parodies. Like we did a Top Gun parody to explain U.S. foreign policy. We did a House Hunters parody to explain the affordable housing crisis, things like that. That was that was the idea of the show, to sort of meld entertainment to help people understand the basic issues facing America, and not for like it's not dumbing it down or anything. Like anyone, I think that the idea is for anyone could watch it and sort of take something away from it and learn and laugh and be entertained, because the world is rough out there these days. So a little respite from the sort of awfulness of it all is appreciated.
So we've talked about now hosting a soccer TV show, hosting political events, the 14 and 16 elections. We've talked about your work with Gimlet on We Came to Win. But sketch comedy, this was new for you, yes?
Yes, that was very new for me.
How'd that feel?
It felt great. I mean, it was a lot of fun. I mean, that's one of the other reasons why I decided to do that was because living in LA, when I moved to LA, I sort of realized I was like, oh my God, there are so many talented people here, like way more talented than me. And if I could just like hire people that are talented, and there's so many of them in LA, like unbelievably talented actors and writers, and it's just like it was just another level from what I was used to in Miami. I mean, that's where like all the most talented people go, right, to try to make it. So I basically just surrounded myself by better performers and funnier people, and I was just kind of like I was usually the straight man, and
you're like, I can do that.
Yeah, I can do the straight man fine. I can memorize lines. I'm good at that,
Yeah.
So yeah.
You come off to me as a fearless guy, Nando. I mean, like, oh, I'll host. Oh, sketch comedy. Let's do it. It just seems like you are pretty much willing to try your hand at, any of these things. And I think that's pretty damn awesome.
Well, I appreciate that. I never thought, I don't think of myself as courageous or brave. I don't know. I think of myself as more irresponsible and.
There's a thin line. It's a thin line between, bravery and.
Yeah.
But I think it's great because it almost makes me think that I speculate that the next opportunity that may come at you, that may be, a slight deviation, related, but something you've never done before, something tells me you're going to have a willingness to give it a shot. And I think that's a cool lesson for folks. It's a cool lesson for me. I mean, because, you've been on TV, you've talked before, and it's like, well, that's what sketch comedy is. We want you to be on TV and talk. It's just a little different.
Right.
And it's like, really, most people in the business will tell you, no, it's a completely different thing. But you're like, no, it's close enough. I'll give it a shot.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, yeah, like, yeah, I don't know. I maybe it is different. It's more different than I realized, and I just kind of went and did it and whatever, like. But yeah, I do wonder what'll be my next move. I'm not quite sure, but I don't know. Maybe something. I don't know, maybe I'll do like a Broadway musical or something crazy like that.
There you go. Well, what's next with We Came to Win? 6 are in the feed at the time of a recording. There might be a little bit more when folks are listening. But how many episode run? Can you share that for folks?
Yeah, we have 4 more episodes. Maybe 5, but definitely 4. And we have great stories coming up. We have a great story about the World Cup's most notorious referee ever. Just a referee that was mired in a major scandal in 2002, which is it's a fun story about a fascinating character who is a very, very strange man. And then we have a very sort of inspiring story that I actually pitched to Gimlet, which is about the Spanish women's national team in 2015. That team had qualified for the World Cup for the first time, the Women's World Cup, and they lost in the first round. And everyone just kind of shrugged and been like, okay, well, whatever. It was the first time they made it. They didn't make it out of the group. That's fine. But then afterwards, they published an open letter, basically demanding that the coach be fired because of grossly inadequate training methods and casual sexism and just a lack of generalized professionalism within the Spanish national team that was truly shocking. You can imagine like a mutiny like that sort of dropped like a nuclear bomb within the Spanish press, and immediately the Spanish women's national team, who previously no one gave a hoot about, were like in the center of this massive storm. And it was these women who were just sort of asserting themselves and demanding professional treatment. The Spanish men's national team is one of the best in the world. They won the World Cup in 2010. They get all the great stuff in the world, whereas the Spanish women are basically ignored and treated as basically they're rec league players, Sunday league players, rather than professional athletes. And these women stood up and they sort of fought for change within the federation, and they achieved some change. The coach was removed and they brought in a new coach, but at the same time, the women who sort of led the revolt were basically removed from the team. So it was kind of like they sort of sacrificed themselves for the greater good of Spanish women's soccer. And it's a story that I'm personally just very inspired by. And talking to these players, it's been a great experience. So I'm very excited to see how that story turns out.
Well, I'm subscribed to the feed. I'm anxious to see what's next. And I know it is always a conversation, and I'm not even going to pitch it the question because I know it's probably still to be decided about a season 2. I know that's always a regular recurring conversation in the Gimlet and similar world. So we'll see. Fingers crossed. I'm sure that's something to be decided down the road. But I'm excited for what's left of this, what I will call the first season, because hopefully that means there's a second. But if folks do want to check this out outside of the links and show notes, which will always be there, folks, Nando, tell folks how to find We Came to Win, how to find Happy Ending with Nando Vila, or how to follow you on social.
So the We Came to Win, you just search We Came to Win wherever you get your podcasts, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, you will find it there. And subscribe and rate and review, all that good stuff. Only if it's going to be a positive review, please, please, please. No, I'm kidding. You can. I support your right to exercise your free speech. You can find me on social at Nando R Vila. That's Nando Rvila on Twitter, Instagram, and whatever. And then Happy Ending. The best way is probably to find the Happy Ending Facebook page. That's the best way to find all the Happy Ending related content you would want. If not, it's on Fusion on Thursday nights at 11, although I know some people don't have cable or have a hard time accessing Fusion. But the best way is on the Facebook page. You could at least see some clips and things like that. So, yeah.
And there's a ton on YouTube.
Yeah.
I found a bunch on YouTube. Very SNL style, where I think most, if not all, segments are right there on YouTube. So
most of the sort of the chunky ones, yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Nando Vila, thank you very much for taking the time to join me here on the Podcast Digest, and good luck in the future, sir.
Thank you so much, Dan.
And that'll do it for episode 153. What'd you guys think? Is Nando the coolest guy walking the face of the earth? I think he could be. It's a good chance. He's got my vote for what it's worth. Go check out We Came to Win. Link in the show notes, folks, as well as a link to Nando's Fusion TV show, Happy Endings with Nando Vila, as well as a link, of course, to Nando's Twitter. All kinds of cool stuff I hope you guys learned about as well. If you're not listening to We Came to Win, you're doing something wrong. Correct that. Subscribe now. You're going to love it. So I just want to also mention before we go, folks, this week's show, as always, has been brought to you by my friends over at Podbean, podbean.com/TPD. That's it, TPD. If you're thinking about starting a podcast or looking for a great home for your existing show, your first month's free. Sign up with that special URL. You can try all of Podbean's great hosting features. That will be a wrap for episode 153. I hope you guys loved it. 154 may not be that far out. I keep alluding to maybe an increased frequency of releases. It's a possibility, folks. So follow me at Pod Digest on all the socials. Twitter is my primary. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. But definitely check me out on Twitter. I want to know, what should I be listening to? Who should I be reaching out to interview? Who should I be talking to? And I don't mean your own show. It's tacky, guys, to say, listen to my own show, all right? If you want me to have your show up on my radar, here's what you do. get your listeners to tweet at me. All right? Tell them at Pod Digest. On your next episode, say, guys, go follow Dan Lizette at Pod Digest. He wants to know that our show's awesome and to take a listen because we want to pop up on there. So that's how you do that. Folks, that'll do it for this episode of the Podcast Digest. Until next time, my name's Dan Lizette.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at Pod Digest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.